Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second LD topic lecture hosted by Outreach Debate Alabama. My name is Chloe Park. I'm the LD director for Outreach Debate, and I'm so excited to be talking about this topic with you. So, for November December, the resolution is resolved the United States ought to rewild substantial tracts of land. I personally think that this is a very ambiguous topic and it's not LD like. So I would emphasize topicality and also just knowing all the background information on rewilding because it is a pretty complex topic. So moving on to just basic information. What is rewilding? Rewilding, stated by Merriam-Webster, is a effort to increase biodiversity and restore the natural processes of an ecosystem that typically involves reducing or ceasing human activity and often the planned reintroduction of a plant or animal species and especially a keystone species. Of course, there are a lot of different definitions of rewilding out there, so I would recommend doing your own research and finding a definition that fits your case the best. But this is just the common definition that Merriam-Webster's has offered. And there are a lot of different ways to rewild. The top three most common, I would say, is removing human infrastructure, reintroducing native species, and letting natural ecological processes resume without human control. There are also a lot of different types of rewilding. There's passive and active and a lot of other ones. So I would definitely do your research and just know what the difference between all these types of rewilding and all these different ways to rewild and the benefits and downsides of all of these as well. Moving on to topicality. Because this topic is so ambiguous, topicality is going to be absolutely crucial. So the word ought in the resolution first indicates a moral obligation and or a policy action. This means that a lot of people are going to have their value be morality. And there are also going to be a lot of policy like plans and counterplans with this topic as well. I think definitely the most controversial word in the resolution is going to be substantial. Substantial in general means significant large scale efforts, but you need to define what is substantial. What makes something a significant and large scale effort? So make sure you have a good definition for substantial because that is definitely going to be a topic of debate. Also, the phrase tracts of land. Does that refer to private or public lands? That's something that the resolution does not clarify, and that's something that you might want to mention in your case as well. And lastly, for just definitions, the word rewild. Because there are so many different types of rewilding, you want to make it clear what type you're going to focus on. Are we going to actively restore or passively conserve? Or are we going to do some other type of rewilding? Make sure you specify that. So, including definitions of at least rewilding and substantial is going to be absolutely imperative in your debate round. Also, one thing to note is that the resolution says the United States ought to rewild, meaning that they're implying that the federal government is going to be doing the rewilding. I don't think that's going to be a huge topic of debate, but make sure you note that it's the federal government. Also, one thing additional that you might want to know is that the resolution doesn't specify where we are rewilding. It doesn't say that rewilding is limited to U.S. lands. So maybe that's something that you can take note of and use it in some way. Moving on to framework. For values, first of all, we have morality, like I mentioned, because of the word ought in the resolution. And second, we have justice, a common value for all cases. But this topic specifically ties into environmental justice really nicely. And the American Public Health Association defines it as all people and communities have the right to live and thrive in a self healthy environment with equal protections and meaningful involvement in these actions. And you could argue for sustainability or intergenerational equity or a lot of other values. Just make sure it fits your case well. Moving on to value criterions for AF and NEC. So, for both of these sides, utilitarianism and deontology will be good philosophies to base your case off of. Util on AF is going to argue that rewilding increases ecological health, climate stability, and human well being, therefore, it is the best option for the most amount of people. Neg, on the other hand, is going to say that rewilding causes economic harm, which is a net loss, so it's bad for the most amount of people. The ontology on AF is going to argue that humans have a duty to restore and protect nature, and that is our moral imperative, while Neg is going to argue that our duty is to respect individuals' autonomy and property rights that rewilding violates. AF, if you want to talk about environmental justice, you could also tie that into mitigating structural violence. Rewilding helps reduce structural environmental injustice. And on neg, you could argue for libertarianism, which is just a philosophy that emphasizes freedoms. So you would say that state imposed rewilding is an unjust intrusion on individual freedoms. AF arguments. I think the two most common ones are going to be biodiversity and climate change, which both have so many impacts that you can lead to, and you could link them all to extinction. Um, yeah. So for biodiversity, it's going to argue that restoring large and connected habitats allow for native species to thrive, it supports migration, and it maintains genetic diversity. Climate change is going to argue that restored forests, wetlands, and grasslands all capture and store significant amounts of carbon dioxide, and therefore it slows global warming. Environmental justice is going to argue that most disadvantaged communities suffer from pollution, lack of green space, etc. So, rewilding improves air and water quality, restores access to resources, reduces health disparities, and promotes equitable access to environmental benefits. And you can also argue for human health, saying that healthy ecosystems filter pollutants, replenish nutrients, and support species that humans rely on. This, in turn, all supports human health, food security, and has economic benefits. And AF arguments continued. First, we have economy, saying that rewilding generates economic opportunities by creating industries like ecotourism and sustainable resource jobs. This also kind of goes hands in hand with innovation, which is going to argue that large scale rewilding projects provide opportunities for research and innovation. And these restored ecosystems can serve as labs to study natural processes and develop new conservation strategies. And lastly, urban sprawl, rewilding discourages destructive urban expansion and promotes responsible land use. Okay, on neg, I think all four of these are going to be very common neg arguments. First being rights and liberties. Forced rewilding infringes on private property rights and individual autonomy, and this sets a dangerous precedent for state overreach. You can impact this out to a lot of different things as well, like democratic backsliding or authoritarianism or all these things. And second, economy. Rewilding disrupts economic activities, and this leads to job losses, decreased food production, and more. So this directly clashes with the AF economy arguments, and I think this is a common argument that NEG is going to find themselves running. And third, we have sovereignty. Top down rewilding policies undermine local communities and indigenous people, and this all leads to social conflicts, loss of cultural practices, and more. And uncertainty, which is going to say that there is not enough empirical evidence behind rewilding to support that it is effective, and therefore we shouldn't do it. So, reintroducing species or changing land use is going to harm the current environments, which causes more ecological instability instead. And lastly, neg arguments continued. Inequity, rewilding driven by federal mandates lead to unequal benefits with wealthy users gaining access while marginalized communities remain excluded. So neg would argue for inequity that if we rewild, we're just going to exacerbate the current inequities, so we shouldn't. And then we have national security, arguing that large tracts of rewilded land reduce infrastructure and land available for national security uses. This can be impacted out to a lot of different things as well. And lastly, we have innovation, which clashes with the AF argument on innovation. Taking out land on production limits innovation in sustainable farming techniques that could be used to feed more people. So, rewilding reduces the incentive to develop sustainable solutions like vertical farming, precision agriculture, and etc. So, I think most debates are going to boil down to these main clash topics. A lot of these also tie into each other, so they're all very vague. First, we have environmental benefits versus economic costs. I think this is pretty straightforward. AF is going to be arguing for environmental benefits, and NEG is going to be arguing for economic cost. Second, we have human responsibility to nature versus human prioritization. So, preservation versus utilitarian use. This also goes hand in hand with the long term environmental gains versus short term human impact. And all of this is going to come down to weighing on time frame and reversibility. AF is going to argue that AF has bigger impacts because their time frame is longer, their solution lasts longer. We're protecting multiple generations. While Neg is going to argue that if we rewild, the current economic cost and the infringement on personal rights is too big. The impact of that outweighs the impact of long term environmental benefits. Reversibility, I think, will be a common strategy that AF is going to use, saying that if we don't rewild, we will see climate change or biodiversity or some other thing cause extinction. And extinction is a impact that cannot be reversed. Therefore, we must rewild. And I think NEG should also be arguing for effectiveness and feasibility, just really emphasizing the fact that there isn't a lot of empirical evidence behind rewilding. Therefore, we don't really know if it's effective or feasible. Therefore, we shouldn't be doing it. So, general tips for AF and NEG. AF, I would highlight the positive impacts on biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and the ecosystem. Also, frame rewilding as a moral imperative. We have nature has an intrinsic value that we must support. We must also protect future generations and promote intergenerational equity. It would be unfair for future generations to live in a world where the environment is degraded while we have access to um, a somewhat good environment. And also, I would emphasize the economic pros to rewilding because for neg, economy is going to be a huge argument. So having that is going to directly clash against their economy contention. And tips for neg, I would stress the loss of livelihoods, restrictions, and government overreach. These are three really big things that have big impacts that you can use to make a persuasive argument for yourself. I would also argue for the complexity, practicality, and cost of rewilding. Find studies that explain that rewilding doesn't have 100% guaranteed solutions. And I would also prioritize human welfare and property rights over the environmental benefits of rewilding. Moving on to progressive debates. I think this topic opens up a lot of room for progressive debate things to happen. So, a lot of plans, a lot of counter plans, and a lot of case. So, for novices that don't know what a counter plan is, a counter plan is something that you can run on neg. It's going to be saying that instead of doing whatever the AF suggests, we should be doing this instead. And you're going to argue that whatever solution you present is going to do the exact same thing that AF's solution is going to do, but you're going to do it without the downsides of it. So, first counter plan is sustainable land management. We should implement sustainable practices that balance ecological health with human use, such as agroforestry or controlled burns. So, you would be arguing that sustainable land management is going to have the exact same benefits as rewilding is going to have, but we're going to do it without having the economic downsides or the infringement on rights, things like that. And the second counterplan is indigenous led land stewardship. I think indigenous people or some argument about indigenous land is going to be huge for this topic. This counterplan specifically is saying that we should be helping indigenous communities restore and manage their lands based on traditional ecological knowledge rather than government mandated rewilding. So, again, avoiding that disadvantage of government overreach. And the last counterplan is climate adaptation. We should prioritize climate adaptation strategies over rewilding to address the immediate climate risks to human communities and infrastructure. So those are the three counterplans that I could think of right now that maybe you might want to run or you might run into in tournaments. Next, progressive stuff, Ks. So, if you don't know what a K is a critique. A critique spelled with a K, it has a weird spelling. What a critique is, it's criticizing the resolution itself. It's saying that the resolution has some underlying negative thing that we must mitigate first. So instead of talking about the actual topic, instead of talking about rewilding, we should be focusing the debate on this other issue, because that other issue is the background for the resolution to stand on, if that makes any sense. So, first, we have anthropocentrism. Anthropocentrism is the argument that humans are so self centered that we prioritize our interests above anything else. So, for this topic specifically, it's going to argue that the resolution is prioritizing human interest and utility over the value of nature. So, AF is framing nature as a resource to benefit humans. And because the resolution has this implication that is implying that we should be prioritizing human interest in self, the resolution itself is wrong. So instead of talking about rewilding, we should talk about anthropocentrism and how that's bad. Next K, we have colonialism, imperialism, or indigenous. Obviously, all three of these Ks have subtle differences, but they're all going to argue the same general idea, and that is going to be that rewilding displaces indigenous peoples and perpetuates settler colonial dynamics. And lastly, we have capitalism. A cap K is something that shows up in almost every single topic. But for this topic specifically, it's going to argue that the root cause of environmental degradation is capitalist economic systems. So instead of talking about rewilding and how we're going to how we're going to help the environment, we should be focusing on capitalism instead, because capitalism is what is driving the environmental degradation. Rewilding may be co opted by market forces, commodifying nature, or ignoring systemic economic change. So these are the three common Ks that you'll run into. I think all three of these Ks are going to be extremely popular. So make sure you have a understanding of what these Ks are going to argue for and what you might be able to say against it. So that was all for this topic lecture. Hopefully this was helpful. And stay tuned in a couple of months for the next topic lecture for LD debate hosted by Outreach Alabama. Thank you for watching.